It was an ordinary sunny afternoon in Los Angeles, the kind where the city buzzes with life and the streets hum with a million stories unfolding at once. But on this particular day, one story was about to stand out, a story so unexpected, it would leave everyone talking for weeks. The camera pans to a bustling downtown area, filled with the familiar chaos of car horns, street vendors, and people rushing by, each lost in their own world. Amid the noise, sitting quietly on the corner of a busy intersection, was a man who seemed to blend into the background. His clothes were tattered, his sneakers barely holding together, and a scruffy hat shadowed his face. He held a cardboard sign that read, "Just need a little help. God bless." To the average passerby, he looked like just another homeless man trying to survive another day. But this wasn't just any man. Beneath the disguise, hidden behind the oversized jacket and carefully staged grime, was none other than Snoop Dogg, a global icon, rap legend, and household name. Known for his laid-back style and smooth rhymes, Snoop had decided to step far outside his comfort zone for an experiment that no one saw coming. He wanted to see firsthand how the world treated those who had seemingly fallen through the cracks. The idea had sparked during a casual conversation with his crew about the unfair treatment of homeless individuals and how society often judged them without a second thought. "Man, what if I went out there and just lived it for a day?" Snoop had joked at first, but the idea stuck with him, and soon enough, it wasn't a joke anymore. With a little help from a professional makeup artist and a wardrobe that looked like it had been through every thrift store in the city, Snoop was unrecognizable. As he sat on that corner, watching people pass by without even a glance, the experiment was already revealing more than he expected. Some people avoided eye contact entirely, quickening their pace as they walked past. Others threw him dismissive looks, as though his mere presence made them uncomfortable. But it wasn't just the passers-by Snoop was observing. He was also keeping an eye out for something else, how the police would respond. Rumors had circulated about certain officers treating homeless individuals harshly, and Snoop wanted to see for himself if there was any truth to it. Would they approach him with compassion, or would their reactions reveal a deeper bias? He was about to find out. Minutes turned into hours, and the sun began to dip lower in the sky. Snoop shifted uncomfortably on the cold pavement, his back aching from the hard surface. Just when he started to wonder if his plan would yield anything worth talking about, a commotion broke out across the street. A police car had pulled up, its lights flashing, and two officers stepped out. They were walking purposefully in his direction. Snoop's heart raced, though he kept his expression neutral, his eyes fixed on the ground. He knew this was the moment he had been waiting for, but nothing could have prepared him for what happened next. What started as a simple social experiment was about to take a turn no one could have anticipated. Snoop kept his head down, the brim of his scruffy hat hiding his face as the officers crossed the street. His heart thumped in his chest, but he reminded himself to stay calm. He had spent hours rehearsing for this moment, practicing how to blend in, how to avoid giving away even a hint of who he really was. But now that it was happening, the weight of the situation hit him. He wasn't just Snoop Dogg in disguise anymore. He was stepping into a reality that countless people lived every single day, a reality he was only beginning to grasp. The officers' boots echoed loudly as they approached. One of them, a tall man with a sharp, authoritative demeanor, scanned the scene with an expression that was hard to read. His partner, shorter and younger, seemed less sure of himself, glancing nervously between the street and the man sitting on the corner. Snoop caught this out of the corner of his eye, but stayed perfectly still, his hands loosely gripping the edges of his cardboard sign. "Hey," the taller officer said, his voice firm but not aggressive. "You can't sit here." Snoop raised his head slightly, just enough to meet their gaze without giving too much away. "I ain't bothering nobody," he mumbled, keeping his tone low and raspy. The officer sighed, clearly impatient. "This is private property. The owner doesn't want people hanging around here." Snoop hesitated. He wasn't sure if he should push back or play it safe, But before he could decide, the younger officer stepped forward. "Sir, do you have somewhere you can go? A shelter, maybe?" The question wasn't rude, but it carried an undertone that rubbed Snoop the wrong way, like he was being talked to, as if he couldn't possibly understand what was good for him. He bit back a sharp reply, reminding himself of the bigger picture. This wasn't about winning an argument. This was about learning, about seeing what would happen if he stayed in character. "Nah, man," Snoop said finally, his voice trailing off. "Just trying to make it through the day." The younger officer hesitated, glancing at his partner as if looking for guidance. The taller man's expression hardened. "If you don't move along, we'll have to write you up for loitering," he said, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. For a moment, Snoop felt a flash of anger. Write him up? For sitting quietly on a corner, not harming a soul. It seemed ridiculous, even cruel. But he also knew that many people in his situation wouldn't have the luxury of feeling angry. They'd just have to take it. So, swallowing his pride, he nodded slowly and began to gather his things. But as he started to stand, something unexpected happened. A woman dressed in a business suit and clearly in a rush stopped nearby. She had been walking briskly, a phone pressed to her ear, but something made her pause. She watched the interaction between Snoop and the officers, her brow furrowing. "Excuse me," she said, stepping closer. Her voice was clear and confident, cutting through the tension. "What's going on here?" The officers turned to her, surprised. The taller one spoke first. "Ma'am, this man is trespassing on private property. We're just asking him to leave." "Trespassing?" The woman repeated, her tone sharp. "He's sitting on a corner. He's not hurting anyone." The younger officer looked uncomfortable, but the taller one stood his ground. "We're enforcing the law, ma'am. If you have a concern, you can take it up with the property owner." The woman didn't back down. Instead, she crossed her arms and fixed the taller officer with a pointed look. "I work just down the street," she said. "I see people sitting here all the time. You don't seem to have a problem with them. So why him?" Snoop watched the exchange with a mixture of gratitude and curiosity. He hadn't expected anyone to step in, especially not a stranger who had no reason to care. Yet here she was, standing her ground against two uniformed officers. The taller officer shifted uncomfortably but didn't respond. The younger one spoke instead. "We're just doing our job, ma'am. We're not trying to cause trouble." "Well, it seems to me that trouble's exactly what you're causing," the woman said firmly. "This man isn't doing anything wrong. Leave him alone." For a moment, it seemed like her words might actually make a difference. The younger officer looked uncertain, glancing at his partner as if waiting for him to make the next move. But the taller officer wasn't backing down. "Ma'am, if you interfere, we'll have to ask you to leave as well," he said, his voice colder now. The tension in the air was palpable. Snoop stayed silent, watching the scene unfold. He couldn't help but wonder how it would end, whether the officers would escalate the situation or back off. Either way, he knew this was a moment he wouldn't forget, a moment that said so much about the world he was trying to understand. But just when it seemed like things might come to a boiling point, something even more surprising happened. A small crowd had started to gather, drawn by the raised voices and the flashing lights of the police car. Among them was a young man holding a smartphone, recording everything. "Hey, leave him alone," someone in the crowd shouted. "Yeah, he's not doing anything wrong," another voice added. The officers glanced around, clearly aware that they were now the center of attention. The taller one's jaw tightened, and for a moment, it seemed like he might double down. But then the younger officer put a hand on his partner's arm, as if urging him to reconsider. "Maybe we should let it go," the younger officer said quietly, his voice barely audible over the murmurs of the crowd. The taller officer hesitated, his eyes darting between the woman, the crowd, and the man sitting quietly on the corner. Finally, with a sharp nod, he stepped back. "Fine," he said curtly, "but if we see you here again, you're getting a citation." With that, the officers turned and walked away, their car pulling out into traffic a moment later. The tension began to dissipate, replaced by a buzz of conversation among the onlookers. Snoop let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. The woman turned to him, her expression softening. "You okay?" she asked. He nodded, still a little stunned. "Yeah, thanks for that." She smiled faintly. "Take care of yourself, okay?" The officers glanced around, clearly aware that they were now the center of attention. The taller one's jaw tightened, and for a moment, it seemed like he might double down. But then the younger officer put a hand on his partner's arm, as if urging him to reconsider. "Maybe we should let it go," the younger officer said quietly, his voice barely audible over the murmurs of the crowd. The taller officer hesitated, his eyes darting between the woman, the crowd, and the man sitting quietly on the corner. Finally, with a sharp nod, he stepped back. "Fine," he said curtly. "But if we see you here again, you're getting a citation." With that, the officers turned and walked away, their car pulling out into traffic a moment later. The tension began to dissipate, replaced by a buzz of conversation among the onlookers. Snoop let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. The woman turned to him, her expression softening. "You okay?" she asked. He nodded, still a little stunned. "Yeah, thanks for that." She smiled faintly. "Take care of yourself, okay?" And with that, she was gone, blending back into the flow of the city. Snoop watched her disappear into the crowd, his mind racing. The experiment had barely begun, but it was already revealing more than he'd imagined, about people, about power, and about how quickly things could shift depending on who was watching. Marcus smirked faintly. "Off and on, trying to keep my head above water, you know." Snoop nodded, his curiosity growing. "What's in the notebook?" Marcus hesitated, then shrugged. "Poetry, stories, stuff to keep me sane." The response caught Snoop off guard. He hadn't expected that answer, and it added another layer to the reality he was experiencing. Marcus wasn't just another face on the street. He was a person with dreams, with creativity, with a story of his own. Their conversation was interrupted by a commotion down the block. A group of teenagers, laughing loudly, had started throwing things. A crumpled soda can, a handful of coins, at another homeless man sitting by a convenience store. The man flinched but didn't say anything, keeping his head down as the teenagers jeered at him. Snoop tensed, instinctively wanting to intervene, but Marcus grabbed his arm. "Don't," he said quietly. "Why not?" Snoop asked, his voice low but firm. "Because it'll only make it worse," Marcus replied. "They're looking for a reaction. If you give them one, they'll just keep going." It was a hard pill to swallow, but Snoop stayed put, watching as the teenagers eventually lost interest and wandered off. The older man by the convenience store slowly gathered his things and moved further down the block, out of sight. "That happens a lot?" Snoop asked after a moment. Marcus nodded grimly. "Too much. People think we're easy targets, like we don't matter." The words hit Snoop like a punch to the gut. He had always known, in a general sense, that being homeless came with challenges, but experiencing it firsthand, even for just a day, was opening his eyes to the depth of the problem. As night fell, the city took on a different vibe. The streets grew quieter, the air cooler. Street lights flickered on, casting a dim glow over the sidewalks. Snoop and Marcus decided to stick together, partly for safety and partly for company. They walked a few blocks to a spot where others had gathered, a small community of people who had banded together for mutual support. Among them was an older woman named Gloria, who seemed to be the unofficial leader of the group. She greeted them with a warm smile and offered them a place to sit near a makeshift fire built in an old metal barrel. "We look out for each other here," Gloria explained as she handed them a piece of bread each. "It's not much, but it's better than being alone out there." Snoop listened intently as Gloria and the others shared their stories. Each one was unique, yet they all carried a common thread of hardship, resilience, and a longing for something better. But just as Snoop was beginning to feel a sense of connection with the group, the sound of footsteps and voices interrupted the calm. Two men, clearly intoxicated, stumbled into the area. They were loud and confrontational, demanding food and money from the group. Gloria stood her ground, her voice calm but firm. "We don't have anything to spare. Please leave us alone." One of the men laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. "Oh, come on. You've got something. Don't make me take it." The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Snoop clenched his fists, his instincts screaming at him to step in. But Marcus placed a hand on his shoulder, a silent reminder to stay cautious. What happened next would test not only Snoop's patience, but also his understanding of the fragile balance these people lived with every day. The night was far from over, and the stakes were only getting higher. The tension around the small fire crackled like the embers glowing in the barrel. The two men, emboldened by whatever they'd been drinking, leaned closer into the group. Their aggressive postures and slurred demands sent a ripple of unease through everyone. Gloria stood her ground, but Snoop could see the flicker of fear in her eyes, her shoulders stiff with determination but not confidence. Marcus whispered under his breath, leaning close to Snoop. "They're trouble. Seen guys like this before. They don't back down easy." Snoop's mind raced. He wasn't used to being in situations like this, where one wrong move could escalate things beyond control. On stage or in front of cameras, he was in charge, commanding attention with ease. But here, sitting in the dirt, his options felt limited. Any move he made could risk exposing himself, or, worse, endangering the group. One of the men, taller and more aggressive, stepped closer to Gloria. "Come on, lady," he sneered, his words dripping with menace. "You gotta have something. Don't make this hard." Gloria didn't flinch, her voice steady. "I told you, we don't have anything to give. Please, just leave us be." The man's expression darkened, his body tensing as though he might lunge forward. Snoop's fists clenched involuntarily. He couldn't sit there and do nothing. But before he could act, a voice cut through the tension like a knife. "Yo, back off." It was Marcus. He stood up, his slight frame seeming much smaller next to the two intruders. But his voice was steady, and his eyes held no fear. "You hurt her. There's nothing here for you." The shorter of the two men laughed, nudging his friend. "Look at this kid, trying to play hero." The taller man smirked, sizing Marcus up. "What you gonna do, huh? You think you're tough?" Marcus didn't back down, his gaze locked on the taller man. "Ain't about being tough. It's about being decent. You don't belong here. Leave." The firelight flickered, casting long shadows that danced across the tense faces in the circle. The group held their breath, their fear palpable. Even Gloria, who had seemed so strong, looked unsure of what might happen next. Snoop couldn't sit still anymore. He rose slowly, his movements deliberate, and stepped beside Marcus. His presence alone added weight to the moment, though he kept his head low, his face hidden beneath the brim of his hat. The taller man turned to Snoop, his expression shifting slightly. There was something about him, even in disguise, that commanded attention. "What's this?" The kid's got back up now. Snoop didn't say anything at first, letting the silence linger just long enough to make the men uncomfortable. Then, in a voice low and steady, he said, "Ain't nobody here scared of you. So why don't you just walk away?" For a moment, it seemed like the men might push back, their bravado teetering on the edge of violence. But then the shorter one glanced around, noticing the way the rest of the group had started to shift, their initial fear giving way to a quiet resolve. Even Gloria, still seated, had straightened her posture, her eyes narrowing as if daring the men to try something. The taller man hesitated, his bravado wavering. He looked at his friend, who gave a slight shrug, clearly less eager for confrontation now that the group seemed ready to stand together. "Whatever," the taller man muttered, his voice full of disdain. "This ain't worth it." With that, the two of them stumbled off into the night, their footsteps fading into the distance. The group let out a collective breath, the tension finally breaking. Thank you, Gloria said softly, her voice filled with gratitude as she looked at Marcus and Snoop. Marcus sat back down, his hands trembling slightly now that the adrenaline was wearing off. Snoop followed, his mind racing. The whole scene had been a stark reminder of just how precarious life on the streets could be. Every moment was a gamble, every night a test of survival. In the end, the mysterious man in the suit never returned. Whether he decided the fight wasn't worth it, or was simply outmaneuvered by the truth, no one knew. But his departure marked a symbolic victory for the group, a testament to the power of courage and unity in the face of adversity. As Snoop sat with the group one last time, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and pink, he felt a sense of peace. The journey had been unexpected, challenging, and at times overwhelming, but it had also been deeply meaningful. He had set out to test perceptions and ended up finding connections that would stay with him forever. "Thank you," he said quietly, addressing the group, "for letting me be part of this, for showing me what strength really looks like." Gloria smiled, her eyes warm. "You were never just a part of it, Snoop. You helped make it happen." As the sun dipped below the horizon, the group laughed, talked, and shared stories, their bonds stronger than ever. It wasn't a perfect ending, but it was real, and it was theirs, and sometimes that was enough. But then something else caught Snoop's attention. The second officer was watching him, his eyes narrowing slightly as if trying to place his face. Snoop turned away, adjusting his hat lower over his face. The last thing he needed was to be recognized now, in the middle of this mess. The officer's gaze lingered for a moment longer before he turned back to his partner. "Let's wrap this up. We've got other calls." As the police left, the group stood in stunned silence, the weight of the citation sinking in. Gloria shook her head, her face etched with a mix of sadness and anger. "This is what we deal with," she said quietly, more to herself than anyone else. "It's not enough that we have nothing. They have to take what little dignity we have left." Marcus kicked a loose piece of gravel, his frustration bubbling over. "It's a joke," he muttered. "They don't care about us. They just want us gone." Snoop felt a pang of guilt. He was here by choice, able to leave whenever he wanted, while these people faced this reality every day. But he couldn't leave now. Not after seeing this. He had to do something, even if he wasn't sure what that was yet. Just as the group began to disperse, trying to figure out their next move, Marcus pulled Snoop aside. "Hey," he said, his voice low but urgent. "I saw you watching that cop. Did you notice anything off?" Snoop frowned, unsure what Marcus meant. "Off how?" Marcus glanced around to make sure no one was listening. "That guy, he wasn't just handing out tickets. I think he was looking for someone." The words sent a chill down Snoop's spine. Had the officer recognized him after all? Or was it something else entirely? Either way, it added a new layer of unease to an already tense situation. Before Snoop could respond, Marcus continued, "We've got to be careful. When cops start taking notes, it's never good. And you—" He hesitated, studying Snoop carefully. "There's something different about you. I don't know what it is, but you stand out." Snoop forced a laugh, trying to play it off. "I'm just another guy out here, same as you." Marcus didn't look convinced, but he didn't press further. "Well, whatever. Just watch your back." As the group moved on, Snoop couldn't shake the feeling that Marcus was right. The officer's lingering gaze, the tickets, the timing of it all, it felt like more than just a routine sweep. Something else was at play, and Snoop was determined to figure out what it was. The day stretched on, each moment tinged with a sense of unease. The group's usual spots were now off limits, and finding a new place to settle proved harder than expected. People were tired, hungry, and demoralized. Snoop stuck close to Marcus, his instincts telling him that the younger man might be key to uncovering whatever was really going on. But as the sun dipped lower in the sky once again, Snoop couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that the officer's warning glance wasn't just random. Whether by coincidence or design, the events of the day had set something in motion, and the tension was building toward a breaking point. The city felt different now, its usual hum of life overshadowed by an undercurrent of something darker. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the city's streets, the group finally found a secluded spot near an abandoned warehouse to settle for the night. The mood was somber, the earlier confrontation with the police still weighing heavily on everyone's minds. Snoop watched as Marcus and Gloria tried to lift the group's spirits, but even their resilience seemed strained. Something about the day felt off, like the tension was leading to an inevitable breaking point. As he stared into the growing darkness, movement in the distance caught his eye. A figure approached, silhouetted against the faint glow of streetlights. Snoop tensed, his instincts on high alert. Marcus noticed too, stepping closer to Snoop and whispering, "You see that?" The figure came closer, stepping into the dim light of the makeshift camp. It was the second officer from earlier, the one who had handed out the citations. He wasn't in uniform now, but there was no mistaking him. The group froze, their conversations cutting off abruptly as the man raised his hands in a gesture of peace. "I'm not here to cause trouble," he said, his voice calm but serious. "I need to talk to you." Gloria stepped forward, her tone wary. "Talk to us? About what?" The officer's eyes scanned the group before settling on Snoop. Him. Snoop's heart skipped a beat. He kept his head low, instinctively pulling his hat down further. The officer stepped closer, his expression unreadable. "Look, I don't know who you really are, but I recognized you earlier, and now I need your help." The group exchanged confused glances. Marcus stepped in front of Snoop, his voice protective. "Help with what? What do you want from him?" The officer hesitated, glancing around nervously. "There's something happening in this city, something bigger than any of us, and I think you're the only one who can expose it." Snoop finally looked up, meeting the officer's gaze. His mind raced. "Expose what?" he asked cautiously. The officer took a deep breath, lowering his voice. "The sweeps, the citations, it's all part of a plan to clear the streets, not for public safety, but to make way for a private development deal. They want this area emptied, no matter the cost, and the people in charge are willing to do whatever it takes to make that happen." The group erupted in murmurs of disbelief and outrage. Gloria's face hardened, her voice cutting through the noise. "You're telling us this now, after you handed us those citations?" The officer nodded, his expression remorseful. "I didn't have a choice. I was following orders. But after seeing what's happening, what they're doing to people, I couldn't stay silent anymore." Snoop felt a surge of anger and determination. This wasn't just about understanding homelessness anymore. It was about exposing corruption and fighting for justice. "Why come to me?" he asked, his voice steady. "Because you have a platform," the officer replied. "You're someone people will listen to. If you speak out, if you show the world what's really happening, it might be enough to stop them." The weight of the moment settled over Snoop. This was bigger than his experiment, bigger than any one person. He glanced at Marcus, who nodded, his eyes filled with quiet resolve. Gloria stepped forward, her voice firm. "If you're serious about this, we'll help. But this has to end tonight." The officer nodded, pulling out a flash drive from his pocket. "This has everything: documents, emails, proof of the deal. Get this out there, and they won't be able to hide anymore." Snoop took the drive, his hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. The group quickly packed up, moving as one toward a nearby community center where they could access the internet. Along the way, Snoop made a few calls to trusted contacts, setting the stage for the story to break wide open. As the files were uploaded and shared, Snoop couldn't help but feel a mix of fear and exhilaration. This wasn't how he had expected the night to go, but it felt right. The truth needed to come out, and he was determined to make sure it did. Hours later, as the story began to spread, Snoop and the group watched the reactions pour in online. Outrage, support, and calls for accountability flooded social media. The corrupt officials were quickly exposed, their plans unraveling in real time. The city's homeless population, often ignored and marginalized, was finally being heard. But just as the group began to celebrate their victory, another figure appeared in the doorway of the community center. This time, it wasn't an officer. It was a well-dressed man in a sharp suit, his expression cold and calculating. "You think this is over," he said, his voice dripping with menace. "You don't know who you're messing with." The room fell silent, the tension thicker than ever. Snoop stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "Maybe I don't, but I know one thing, you can't hide the truth anymore." The man's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, it seemed like he might retaliate. But then he turned and walked away, leaving the group to wonder what consequences might still lie ahead. As dawn broke, Snoop looked around at the group, their faces filled with hope and determination. The fight wasn't over, but they had taken the first step, and for the first time, it felt like change was possible. As the mysterious man's footsteps faded into the early morning quiet, the group stood frozen, unsure of what to do next. The weight of his threat hung in the air, and for a moment, even the small victory they had achieved felt fragile. Snoop glanced at Marcus, who was gripping the edge of the table so tightly his knuckles were white. Gloria, ever the steady presence, let out a slow breath and spoke first. "Well," she said, her voice calm but resolute, "if they think a suit and some big words are going to scare us off, they've got another thing coming." Her words broke the tension, and the group began to nod in agreement. They had already faced so much. What was one more challenge? Snoop felt a swell of pride for the people around him. Their resilience was unshakable, and their willingness to stand together was something he wouldn't forget. But the reality of the situation couldn't be ignored. Snoop turned to the officer, who had stayed with them through the upload and watched everything unfold. "Who was that guy?" Snoop asked, keeping his voice low. The officer frowned, his face pale. "He's one of the big players behind the development deal. If he's here, it means he knows the story is gaining traction. And if he knows that, it means they're getting desperate." "Desperate people make mistakes," Marcus said, his voice sharper than usual. "That's how we'll beat them." Snoop nodded, appreciating Marcus's fire. But he also knew they couldn't rely on just public outcry. They needed to stay one step ahead. "We've done what we can tonight," Snoop said. "The story's out there. Now we need to regroup and figure out what comes next." The group decided to leave the community center, sticking together for safety. As they walked through the quiet streets, the sky began to lighten with the first signs of dawn. Snoop's phone buzzed in his pocket, and when he checked it, he saw dozens of messages and missed calls from friends and colleagues in the industry. The story was spreading faster than he had imagined, and people wanted to know more. They reached another quiet spot, a small park tucked away from the main roads. The group settled on the benches, sharing what little food they had left and discussing their next steps. Gloria suggested organizing a public gathering to bring more attention to the issue. Marcus wanted to dig deeper into the development deal and expose everyone involved. Even the officer, who had initially seemed unsure about his role, offered to testify if it came to that. Snoop listened, absorbing their ideas and thinking about how to use his platform to amplify their voices. He had started this journey out of curiosity, but now it was personal. He had seen the struggles, the injustices, and the humanity of the people's society so often overlooked. He wasn't just an observer anymore, he was part of the fight. By mid-morning, the group's spirits had lifted. People passing through the park stopped to talk, some offering words of support, others bringing food and supplies. It was a small but meaningful show of solidarity, and it reminded everyone that they weren't alone in this. As the day wore on, Snoop's phone buzzed again. This time, it was a call from one of his contacts at a major news outlet. They wanted to interview him about the story and the experiences that had led him to uncover it. Snoop hesitated for a moment, glancing at the group around him. This wasn't just his story, it was theirs too. He decided to take the call, but made it clear that the focus needed to be on the people who had lived this reality every day. The interview aired later that evening, and it was a turning point. Snoop spoke candidly about what he had seen and learned, highlighting the resilience of the people he had met and the systemic issues they faced. Marcus, Gloria, and a few others joined him, sharing their own stories and calling for action. The response was overwhelming. Donations poured in for local shelters and outreach programs, and city officials were forced to address the allegations. In the weeks that followed, the corrupt development deal unraveled under public scrutiny. Investigations were launched, and several officials resigned or faced legal action. The officer who had come forward became a key whistleblower, his testimony helping to bring more of the truth to light. The city announced plans to review its policies on homelessness and pledged to work with community organizations to find real solutions. For the group, life didn't change overnight. There were still challenges, still days when hope felt out of reach. But there was also a renewed sense of possibility. Gloria began working with a local nonprofit to advocate for housing rights. Marcus started a blog to document the stories of people living on the streets, determined to keep their voices from being silenced. Even the officer, once a reluctant ally, found a new purpose in standing up for justice. As for Snoop, the experience changed him in ways he hadn't expected. He returned to his life with a deeper understanding of the struggles people faced and a commitment to using his platform for good. The video he eventually released wasn't just a story about a social experiment, it was a call to action, a reminder that everyone has a role to play in making the world a better place. The video went viral, reaching millions of viewers around the world. People were moved by the honesty and humanity of the story, and many were inspired to get involved in their own communities. It was a powerful reminder that change starts with awareness and grows through collective effort. In the end, the mysterious man in the suit never returned. Whether he decided the fight wasn't worth it or was simply outmaneuvered by the truth, no one knew. But his departure marked a symbolic victory for the group, a testament to the power of courage and unity in the face of adversity. As Snoop sat with the group one last time, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and pink, he felt a sense of peace. The journey had been unexpected, challenging, and at times overwhelming, but it had also been deeply meaningful. He had set out to test perceptions and ended up finding connections that would stay with him forever. "Thank you," he said quietly, addressing the group, "for letting me be part of this, for showing me what strength really looks like." Gloria smiled, her eyes warm. "You were never just a part of it, Snoop. You helped make it happen." As the sun dipped below the horizon, the group laughed, talked, and shared stories, their bonds stronger than ever. It wasn't a perfect ending, but it was real, and it was theirs, and sometimes that was enough.